leading the revolution of talk radio. Lynn Cullen.
Hello there. Welcome back. When last we spoke, I was trying to figure out whether Israel was in Asia, Africa, or Europe. And I've just read the entire Wikipedia entry, and I still can't figure it out. So, never mind. It is where it is. It is what it is. And you know what is, too? We got David Marinus back with us. Last time we had him here, we were talking about his wonderful book on our own. We do claim him, Roberto Clemente. And now, given the fact that some of us are a little blurry-eyed from staying up late watching the pommel horse, because the Olympics are going on, David Marinus' latest book is called Rome 1960. He is referring to the Olympics of that year. The subtitle might surprise you, The Olympics That Changed the World. Welcome, David Marinus.
Thanks, Lynn. Good to be back with you.
Nice to have you here. What do you mean, the Olympics that changed the world? I don't recall. I was around, sort of, kind of. 60 was a heck of a year, but I don't remember the Olympics changing the world.
60 was a heck of a year.
Yeah.
And, I should start with a caveat. That's not my subtitle.
Who's it? You mean they put that on without even asking you?
No, they asked me, but it was a compromise over what the title would be in the subtitle. And I was leery of that subtitle as a little bit of hyperbole, but I accepted it so I can defend it. These were the first commercially broadcast televised games. The first doping scandal occurred at those games. The first athlete to take money to wear a certain brand of track shoes occurred at those games.
There's a harbinger.
There were major advances for third world countries, for African Americans and women at those games. So for better or worse, you could see the whole modern world coming into view. And that really is the theme of the book, that here's a point of transformation, quiet transformation, but profound. Some of the other Olympics, like 1968 with a Black Power salute of Tommy Smith and John Carlos, or the tragedy of Munich in 1972, the murder of the Israelis, those are better known for a single event. But 1960 was a much more widespread, deeper, transformational moment.
None of it apparent to anybody observing it at the time.
Well, a few things were apparent. I mean, Rayford Johnson was the first black ever to carry the American flag at the opening ceremony.
Was that considered outrageous by certain elements in this country?
Well, you know what 1960 was like. I mean, there were race riots in Jacksonville, Florida, as the Olympics were going on. There were boycotts of department stores that discriminated against blacks and sit-ins at lunch counters. And the racial issue, in that early stage of the civil rights movement was, in full flare. And the Soviets, in the heat of that Cold War moment, and it was a very tense time in the Cold War, the Soviets were pounding away at the American claims to being the beacon of liberty around the world because they had such an obvious hypocrisy at home. So Rayford Johnson's choice to carry the flag was an important symbolic moment.
And whose choice was that, and was it done to make a political point?
Yes, it was. The choice was the powers that be, the Olympic establishment, realized that they had to give the world a different face, and they chose Rayford. He deserved it, though. He was the captain of the team. He was a fabulous athlete and a great human being, and in every way he deserved the honor. He was the most respected member of the team, but he understood that to some degree he was being manipulated.
Or used. Exploited.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Is it ever possible to remove any Olympics from the politics of the day?
No, it's not. It's the one time when the entire world is in the same place at the same time. There's always going to be politics. Now we have the Beijing Olympics. Well, 50 years ago exactly, mainland China withdrew from the Olympics entirely in 1958 out of protest that its mortal enemy Taiwan was allowed to participate. Then in 1960, the International Olympic Committee ruled that Taiwan could compete if it called itself Taiwan or Formosa, but it couldn't use the name Republic of China, which is what Chiang Kai-shek's silent nation liked to call itself. And so then all of a sudden they were about to boycott the Olympics. The State Department wanted Taiwan to boycott, and they would have. Instead, they walked into the opening ceremony and unfurled a banner that read, "Under protest." The politics is always there in one way or another.
Do you recall what the Taiwanese athletic delegation, when they marched into the Beijing Games, was called?
Chinese Taipei.
Chinese Taipei.
Yes.
Again, something that it does not call itself.
Right. Exactly. So that was a compromise they made for this one.
But there was no under protest banner this time.
Well, they've made some moves at reconciliation over the many tense decades.
I'm thinking in terms of politics in the Olympics. I mean, my heavens, you have Georgian athletes grappling with Russian athletes, even as their countries are at war. It is bizarre.
Yeah, well, that in 1960, the East and West German teams competed as one unified team, so-called, because East Germany wasn't recognized as a separate country by the West yet. So they were told that if they wanted to compete, it had to be as one team, and they lived in the same Olympic quarters, even though the officials hated each other's guts. This was only months before the Berlin Wall went up.
Wow.
And the athletes themselves got along okay. You can see that sort of, athletes have their own world, and the ideology is imposed upon them, but it's not part of what they're doing. So, they can have respect across any kind of political divide.
Now, these games we have going on now, they're available for viewing essentially 24 hours a day on 6 separate channels. I understand there's like 82 hours a day of Olympic programming available to us here in this country during the games. What were we seeing in 1960 here in the U.S.?
In 1960, you saw about an hour or a little more than an hour a day. It was CBS that had the rights then. They paid about $500,000 for it, compared to the $1 billion plus that NBC paid. NBC sent 2,900 employees to Beijing. CBS in 1960 sent fewer than 50, only 3 of whom were announcers. It was right before satellite transatlantic broadcast, so it wasn't live. They literally would put the canisters of film and videotape on commercial jets and fly them back from Rome to New York every day, hoping that the time difference could allow them to get some of the events onto the show that late that night. And when it got to New York, that's where Jim McKay came in. He was hosting his first Olympics in 1960 for CBS. He wasn't even in Rome. He was in New York. And as he described it to me, he would be banging out his script on a portable typewriter, watching while the editors cut and pasted that night's show.
So it was really fly by the seat of our pants. And is it true because the film canisters came in the belly of a plane? They were cold?
That's the story. That yes, they'd be so cold that McKay and the editors would stick them under their armpits to warm them up.
Because you couldn't splice them when they were cold.
Yes.
Too much. So there's Jim McKay probably sitting on canisters of film with others tucked under his arms. Unbelievable. So, wow, 60 years. So that's 48 years ago. 48 years ago. And to think of the difference that has occurred in those 48 years, it really is pretty mind-boggling.
The change came exponentially since then. And the combination of television and commercialism, that synergy really changed everything.
No discussion of the Olympics back then can occur without mentioning the name of the devil incarnate, Avery Brundage.
Yes, he was the president of the International Olympic Committee. Before that, he'd been the head of the American Olympic Committee.
Did even his own wife like him?
Well, she didn't know that he had a separate family apart from her.
Oh, did he really?
Oh, yes. He was a complete hypocrite. He had a mistress and 2 sons from another woman that he housed somewhere else, and was a complete philanderer at the same time that he was moralizing about athletes. So that was one of his many interesting sides.
I have never heard anything positive spoken of Avery Brundage.
I can try to give him his due on one sense.
Okay.
He was a megalomaniac who believed that the Olympic movement was bigger than any religion or ideology. And so sometimes that put him to the right place. Not very often, but once in a while. Everybody hated him at one point or another. And when that happens, sometimes you accidentally do something right.
Correct.
What he did was he helped keep the Olympic movement together during those very, tense middle decades of the 20th century. So that's giving him his due, but that's about it. He was a complete anti-Semite. I mean, his anti-Semitism is utterly indefensible, and it came out in this book when I was researching his role in the 1936 Olympics, which were staged in Nazi Germany. And Brundage then ran the American Olympic Committee, as it was called, and there was a real dispute about whether the U.S. should go to those games and give the Nazis that stage. Attempted boycotts were organized by Jewish groups in the U.S. Brundage opposed those boycotts, that part is debatable, but his behavior was not. I found that he wrote letters to German officials essentially saying, there's a lot of negative publicity coming out of Hitler's Nazi Germany right now. Why don't you send me some clippings about all the good things you're doing? I mean, that was Brundage.
That was Avery Brundage.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me get a break in here, David, and we'll come back. We're talking to David Marinus. Hey, did I hear somebody tell me that excuse us just for a minute, the Capital Times is no more?
Yes. The Madison Capital Times, the paper that I grew up with, exists online and as a weekly, but as a daily, it's dead.
We're talking about Madison, Wisconsin, where
Right.
I used to call home, and your dad was
My dad was at one point the editor of the.
when I lived there, he was the editor. Oh, how have the mighty fallen!
Yeah, well, newspapers are reeling. It's
Oh God. Nothing stays the same. I guess that's part of what this book is all about. This book being Rome 1960 by David Marinus. We'll be back. Well, not surprisingly, we're talking about the Olympics. Perhaps surprisingly, we're talking about the 1960 Olympics that were held in Rome. There's so much to cover here, David. Let's talk about the fact that the Cold War raging in the 60s, there were actually, spies operating at the game?
Yeah, well, that was not uncommon in that era. There were spies anywhere that people from East and West were together. But Rome was teeming with spies. And the book recounts in detail one really fascinating effort to get a Soviet athlete to defect, and the recruitment of an American for that cause. Dave Sim was a sprinter on the U.S. team and a medical student at Duke University who had been familiar to the State Department because he'd gone on a State Department tour of Asia before. And before the Rome Games started, they called him down to Washington and showed him a dossier of a Soviet athlete and said, "This is Igor Terovanessian. He's a long jumper for the Soviets. He loves the West. He loves jazz. He's learning English. We've been watching him for a couple of years, and we think he might be a candidate for defection, and we'd like you to help." So Sim said he would do what he could, and he befriended Igor in Rome, and they went out to eat and talked about the benefits of the West versus the East. And the plan was that a CIA agent who went by the pseudonym Mr. Wolf would show up and close the deal. As both Sim and Igor told me in separate interviews, this agent showed up and scared the heck out of Igor. It seemed like he knew too much about him. He knew that his parents were from Soviet Armenia and started talking to Igor in the dialect, and it scared the heck out of him. He thought he was a double agent. So he bolted from the table and said, "Dave Sim, I trust you, I don't trust." And the deal was botched. But there were defections, not involving athletes. A Latvian KGB agent walked into the American embassy during those games and sought asylum. Instead of giving him that, they turned him around and made him a double agent for the next 25 years.
Oh, brother. Not what the poor guy wanted.
Well, he finally came out from the cold in Washington in the 1980s. But, yeah.
So were we, as I recall, the medal count then was all about beating the Russians.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was a battlefront in the Cold War.
Right.
And that's the way it was treated by both sides. The Soviets actually won the medal count in 1960, and one reason they did is they swept through the gymnastics medals, and there are a lot of them. And really that was kind of a wake-up call for the U.S. in terms of gymnastics and some of the other, at that point, events that were considered lesser events. Now, ironically, gymnastics is the biggest draw for television in the Olympics. But at that point, nobody paid any attention to American gymnastics. And so, yes, the medal count was huge. When the Soviets would win an event, I read translations of Izvestiy and Pravda, the Russian papers, and every time a Soviet won, it wasn't because of their individual prowess, but because of the superiority of the socialist system. And that's the way it was sort of presented around the world.
And this is, but at the time, these athletes weren't they state sponsored? I mean, they were trained.
Completely, yeah.
And our athletes didn't have anywhere near the kind of training that they do today, I suspect.
No, they didn't. They were sort of part-time athletes for the most part, Americans. And it was imbalanced, absolutely. The Soviet team was state-sponsored, and the Americans were held to sort of an amateur code that at times could get pretty ridiculous. There's a story in the book about a great hurdler named Lee Calhoun from Gary, Indiana, at North Carolina College, who won the gold medal in 1956 in Melbourne and won it again in 1960 in Rome. But in between, he'd been suspended for an entire year because he and his young bride got married on the TV show Bride and Groom, and they accepted a few wedding presents, and that was considered a breach of the amateur code. So it was that kind of draconian application of amateurism in the U.S. versus the state-sponsored teams in the Soviet Union that led to some imbalances. Now it's completely different. The Chinese are the ones today who you would say have a state-sponsored system.
Right.
But on the other side, you've got this completely free-for-all capitalism going on in professionalism from the U.S. So it's more of a fair fight.
I mean, gee whiz, when did I recall that back then we did think of these athletes as true amateurs.
Right.
How the heck did we ever get to the point of where LeBron James and Kobe Bryant and Fedorov and all the others are at the Olympics?
Well, part of it was because the U.S. didn't want to lose so much. And part of it was because of the, it's kind of like, compare it to baseball, where in the old days you had the reserve clause, which kept players, slaves to the various teams. And now you have these multimillionaire free agents going around making more and more money. It usually starts with an inequity. And in the old amateur system, which one likes to think of as pure and golden,
right.
It was essentially imposed from above by, Avery Brundage, the head of the Olympic Committee, was a multimillionaire real estate magnate from Chicago and Santa Barbara, California. His coterie of on the executive committee of the International Olympic Committee were all princes and dukes and marquises from Europe. And it's easy for people of that sort to talk about the purity of athletics and how you shouldn't take any money for it, because they didn't need it. But most athletes come out of hunger and poverty, and it's true in Olympic sports as much as anywhere else. So there was bound to be that tension that would break at some point.
So these athletes, these poor athletes, were not able to cash in at all. I mean,
not really. Very few. I mean, Cassius Clay obviously did in boxing. He became Muhammad Ali. He won a gold medal in Rome, the most famous athlete in the world later. But in almost all Olympic sports, there's no future after the Olympics. And, to train and become a world-class athlete, you need some kind of help. And so that was the tension that broke eventually. Along with in basketball, where they didn't need the help, they just wanted to win.
Were we winning in basketball back then? I would.
Oh yeah, in 1960 it was the real dream team. That was a backcourt of Jerry West and Oscar Robertson. Not bad.
Not bad.
And they won every game by an average of 30 points, and it was all college guys and amateurs. But they could start to see the world catching up even in 1960, and And eventually, obviously, the world did catch up.
Indeed. Well, as you look at these Olympics now and you look at those Olympics in the 60s,
Yeah.
which do you think were more, I don't know, I don't want to say pure, but which were more indicative of the idea behind the Olympics?
I think you can find, here's my take on it, Lynn. I don't think that human nature changes. I think the culture changes around it. I don't think that the athletes then were morally superior to the athletes today. They're just so many more temptations today. And so when you have everything shrouded by money and doping, it's harder for the average viewer to buy into it. You know, once in a while you can. I mean, Michael Phelps obviously has caught the world's attention at these Olympics, and he seems like he's not a complete egomaniac. He seems like an interesting human being as well as a great athlete. So, I'm not saying that any athlete from 1960 is superior to him in any way, but it was because the culture was different then, because there was less excess in every possible respect.
Right.
I think it was probably more enjoyable then.
It was more enjoyable then.
I think so.
A little less tainted.
Yes.
We're talking to David Marinus about his book, Rome, 1960. That was the site of the Olympics that year. First time we saw a kid named Cassius Clay. Did I understand that he was not real popular there, or was he?
Well, it's not that he wasn't real popular. It's that he was only 18 years old, and he was kind of a pest. It's not that anybody hated him. They just were a little bit sick of him. He had the same personality then that he would have later as Muhammad Ali, but he didn't have the meaning behind it yet. He hadn't been tested politically or in any other way. So
he's a little too sure of himself?
His braggadocio and rhyming and saying he was the greatest at age 18, made his teammates roll their eyes, basically. He was afraid to fly. They had to give him sleeping pills to get him on the plane to Rome. He yacked his way across the Atlantic. The pills didn't work. By the second or third day in the Olympic Village, it seemed that every other athlete from around the world knew about this American kid who wouldn't shut up. And, that's sort of the way he was over there. But he was even at 18, he was a great boxer who won the light heavyweight gold medal. He wouldn't take it off after he won it. He wore it to bed that night and was walking around the village the next day with the medal dangling around his neck.
Was that considered untoward?
A little bit. One of the women athletes from the U.S. told me that she saw Cassius coming and just said, "Fool, go find some place and sit down for a while."
You're not naming names.
Yeah, that was Lucinda Williams. She was one of the Tiger Bells from Tennessee State.
The Tiger Bells being sprinters?
Yeah, they were great sprinters from the historically black college in Nashville, Tennessee State, and their leader was Wilma Rudolph, who was the shining star of the Olympics.
Let's get into Wilma, because I know her story is just amazing.
Yeah,
but
really is.
let me take a mid-break, it being about 10:30 here. I'm Lynn Cullen. We're talking to David Marinus, his most recent book, Rome, 1960. We'll be back. We're talking to David Marinus, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Last spoke to him about his book, Clemente, his latest book, Rome, 1960. You mentioned Wilma Rudolph. She's just, her story's amazing.
It truly is. Wilma Rudolph from Clarksville, Tennessee. Her parents had 22 children. As a child, she had both polio and scarlet fever. She wore leg braces for several years. Her mom, a maid, would get on a Greyhound bus with her every week and ride down from Clarksville to Nashville, Tennessee for her to get treatment at Meharry Medical Center, the one black teaching hospital in the South. She overcame all of that. At age 15, she was a great basketball player in her high school. By 16, she was part of the bronze medal-winning relay team in Melbourne. She came back from that and was a hero in her high school, and then she got pregnant, so she was a teenage mother, and then arrived in Rome at age 20, overcoming all of that to win 3 gold medals. It's the 100-meter dash, the 200-meter dash, and the anchor of the relay team with her teammates from the Tennessee State. And she had just such a willowy, lithe, agile style and charisma about her, and these were the first televised Olympics, and it seemed like the whole world fell in love with Wilma. And she was an inspiration to all women athletes for many decades to follow.
Was she in any other Olympics after 60?
No, she wasn't. She was by the next Olympics. She'd had another child and was teaching and coaching.
Did you have an opportunity to talk to her?
No, she died of brain cancer in the early 1990s. So I didn't, sadly. I talked to her coach, Ed Temple, an amazing guy who's 87 years old, and to several other of the Tiger Bells, her teammates, but not Wilma was gone by then.
And when she returned to the United States, I understand that she went to the White House?
Well, everybody wanted a part of Wilma. After she came back, there's a story in the book where her coach, Ed Temple, his wife is looking out the picture window of their house and says, "Hey, Ed, do you know anybody who drives a pink Cadillac?" And it was Cassius Clay, who'd driven down from Louisville because he was totally smitten by Wilma. She was invited to the White House, and John Kennedy was so taken by her that he was trying to sit down and missed his favorite rocking chair and almost fell on the floor. But the great story about Wilma coming back is that her hometown of Clarksville wanted to hold a parade and banquet in her honor because she was the hero of the Olympics. And at age 20, she had the guts to say no, not unless the event is integrated. And she forced Clarksville in that Jim Crow segregation era to hold a banquet where blacks and whites sat together at the same tables for the first time.
Wow.
Yeah.
But the next day, everybody went back to business.
Oh, yeah, and in 1963, there's a scene where Wilma was helping part of a civil rights action to try to integrate a Shoney's, or desegregate a Shoney's restaurant in Clarksville, and they padlocked the doors, did not let her in.
Wow.
So, yeah.
You know, one of the things, David, that I remember about those years was the judging. I remember all these grim-looking judges. You always worried because the East German judge and the Russian judge, no matter what our people did, if there was a subjective anything going on, does that? I have a feeling that sort of seems to not be in play as much, but I don't know.
Well, no, there was judging controversies in the Winter Olympics. You remember with the the judges who were, they were actually conspiring and.
Well, those there were some French judges,
exactly.
Right?
So
That's right.
I think that in subjective competitions that will always take place. Sometimes it's ideological. Sometimes it's just who knows what. In Rome in 1960, there was a ridiculous case where, in the 100-meter freestyle swimming event. It was Lance Larson of the U.S. against an Australian named John Devitt, who were the two best. And the stopwatches showed that the American Lance Larson had won by a couple hundredths of a second. And the judges on the side of the pool called it a tie. And then the head judge, who wasn't even in a position to see anything, gave the gold medal to the Australian. It was before the era of electronic touch pads, so it was subjective. And in order to give the Australian the gold medal, they had to literally change the times of the American so that he didn't have a better time. And in boxing, I think about half of the judges were fired before they got to the finals of the judging because of either incompetence or some fears that there was Eastern Bloc voting going on in Rome. And I think that's an inevitable part of the Olympics.
So... I know that was not your subtitle, the Olympics that changed the world, but what is there a demarcation of some sort that happens in 1960 that you think is worthy of that kind of as you said?
Well, yeah, no, I think it's a combination of all of the aspects of the modern world. As I said, the first doping scandal was at those Olympics.
And what was that?
That was a Danish cyclist died during the road race on the first day of competition. And at first they thought it was heat stroke. And then a day later, a Danish trainer acknowledged that he'd been administering a blood doping agent to the cyclists. And even though there had been suspicions about amphetamine use and steroid use before that, that single death in Rome was the impetus for all of the drug testing that would follow in the Olympics. And so that truly is a point of demarcation, as is television, as is the case of the athlete Armin Hari, a German sprinter, being paid by Puma and Adidas to wear their shoes at the Olympics, as was Rafer Johnson's carrying of the American flag and Wilma Rudolph breaking the barrier, and Bibi Bikila, I haven't even mentioned him yet. He was the Ethiopian who won the marathon running barefoot through the streets of Rome.
Because he couldn't afford shoes, or because that's the way he ran?
No, because he didn't like his shoes. They gave him blisters. And he would run barefoot at times back in Ethiopia. So he just ditched his shoes. Before the event started, an American marathoner, Gordon McKenzie, told me he looked over on the Capitoline steps where they were warming up and saw this skinny little guy, all sticks and bones and no shoes, and turned to his teammate and said, "Well, there's one guy we're not going to have to worry about."
Whoops.
And yeah, right. And it turns out that Bikila, won with the best time ever in a marathon to that point, and he did it running through, the streets of the capital of the country that had invaded his homeland and pounded the cities of Ethiopia with horrible chemical mustard gases only 25 years earlier.
Wow.
So, and he was the first black African ever to win a gold medal.
Really?
Paving the way for all of the great East African distance runners to follow. So I think you can look in every possible way and see some transformative event in 1960.
Is he alive?
Bibi Bikila died. He won the gold medal again in Tokyo in 1964.
Again barefoot?
No, he wore shoes that time. And he was about to win again in Mexico City, but he got injured before the race. And then shortly after that, he got in a traffic accident and was wheelchair-bound and died at an early age.
Was of all of the personalities that emerged from that game, was he the biggest, or was it Wilma Rudolph?
Depending on, I call it a four-way tie. I mean, from the Western perspective, there was a Soviet gymnast, Boris Salkin, who won 5 gold medals and was, a great hero of the state in the Soviet Union. But from the American perspective, it was, at the top, it was Wilma Rudolph and Rafer Johnson. And below that, it was Cassius Clay, who, would become the biggest of them all, but he wasn't then. And then Bibi Bikila was an amazing international story.
Why was Cassius Clay so big? I mean, so he won a gold medal in, didn't we? We did pretty well, I would imagine, in boxing. Why did he?
3 gold medals, and it was there were 5 Italians in the finals, and all of the matches were held the same night. The Palazzo dello Sport was jammed with 17,000 fanatic Italian fans who were booing and whistling against the Americans the whole night. And so when Cassius came out after a controversial decision right before that, which had just sent the stadium into an uproar, he knew he had to fight the fight of his life, which he did. He had that personality then, and it sort of he always could draw attention to himself, and he was a great boxer at the same time.
So, I mean, what's fascinating to me is that all the 3 Americans you mentioned,
right,
as standing out, are all African Americans.
Yes.
And this at a time, again, if we can bring ourselves back there, 1960, when this country was still so unbelievably segregated and had not in any way come to terms with
No, you're
that.
Absolutely right.
And that didn't change. I mean, where was the disconnect? Where was the cognitive dissonance?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think change comes, I think change comes over a long period of time. I mean, this year you've got Barack Obama. Well, he didn't just come out of nowhere. He came out of 50 years of transformation in this country. And, I think it starts right around, in the late 50s and around 60. So I think that all of these things add up in slow ways, accretion of change.
1960, Rome, 1960. That's the name of David Marinus's latest book. And I'm sorry, David, I've always read your books beforehand. This one I haven't because it just came today.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
I am too.
But I hope you enjoy it.
I'm sure I will. Actually, I'm fighting with my producer over who gets it first. But I'm sure I will. Anybody want to get a question in here, I'll invite you into the last 15 minutes. 412-333-1360 is the phone number. Lynn Cullen with David Marinus and talking about Rome, 1960. We'll be back.
Do you have foot, leg, or back pain? Do you have trouble with your balance? Do you have tired, aching feet? If this sounds like you, there's only one store to relieve your pain. Best Made Shoes in Bloomfield. Best Made Shoes for 31 years has orthotics, arch supports, and comfort shoes to end your pain. Best Made Shoes, custom-made shoes and orthotics are great for relief from plantar fasciitis, edema, bunions, calluses, heel spurs, and flat feet. Best Made Shoes specializes in diabetic shoes that come in multiple sizes and widths. Diabetic shoes that fit better than regular shoes with no inside seams for rubbing bunions or hammer toes. Best Made Shoes is a Medicare and HMO provider for diabetic shoes. Most of these shoes are free or of little cost. Best Made Shoes still makes house calls to customers who are unable to come to their store. For 3 generations, Best Made Shoes has found the solutions to your foot problems. End your pain today. Call 412-621-9363. That's 412-621-9363. Or visit them on the web at bestmadeshoes.com.
I'm not a corporate guy, so I started my own business. It surprised me when my CPA asked if I formed a corporation or LLC. He explained to me that if I didn't, I could lose everything. My house, my cars, my life savings. All it would take is one little mistake. He told me to visit bizfilings.com. They walked me through each step in the process, and it only took a few minutes. I'm still not a corporate guy, but I'm glad I incorporated.
Protect your personal assets. Visit bizfilings.com. No legal fees, no hassle.
It's the American entrepreneur, Ron Morris, on AM News Talk 1360.
There are people that go into the office in the morning and they will spend the first 2 hours of the day, the first 45 minutes is getting coffee, and then they hit the email, and they'll spend 2 hours or more reading emails and sending them back, sometimes to the guy in the next cubicle.
Yeah, it's stupid. And there's no interaction.
Right.
No interaction whatsoever. And it's like...
And it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse as the IM generation comes into play, I think.
The last thing I want to see is my sons be stuck in... I couldn't think of anything worse than being stuck in a cubicle. I mean, put a bullet in me at that point. I mean, it's over.
Yeah, that's right.
I couldn't do it. But like I said, the entrepreneur life, as you well know, is a lot tougher. And it's tougher on your marriage. It's tougher on your home. It's tougher on everything. But you know what? When it finally hits... and I'm only imagining, now this is my first time through it, but I'm only imagining how good it's going to be when it finally breaks.
It's the Marine Corps of business.
Join Ron Morris Saturday mornings from 9 a.m. till 12:30. It's the American Entrepreneur on AM News Talk 1360. AM News Talk 1360 is streaming on the internet 24 hours a day. 1360WPTT.com. Click the Listen Live icon and hear us anywhere in the world.
Well, I'm talking to, actually, the Herald Tribune called you a gold medalist of a writer. And that's David Marinus and his book, Rome, 1960. Great quote you unearthed from Red Smith about what a great quote, about the decathlon. A quadrennial chance for guys who can't do anything very well to win interplanetary renown by doing many things in a great blaze of mediocrity.
Yeah, Red Smith was always, he was one of the great columnists of all time.
I think he was a Wisconsinite. He was a Wisconsinite, too.
From Green Bay.
You betcha.
Yeah,
That's where I'm from. I love it. I know. He went to Green Bay West. I went to Green Bay East. But
is that right?
Yeah, we claim him. Absolutely. Gosh, is that... So, I mean, what you really had covering the Olympics then, though, were all these crusty old newspaper sports guys,
yeah, it was,
right?
They were still at the top of the food chain in the media then, the big city sports columnists and magazine writers. So, in Rome, you had A.J. Liebling, you had Red Smith, Shirley Povich, the great writer for the Washington Post, and they sort of traveled as a tribe, and, they had a nice life, those guys. Most of them went over to Europe a few months early, took a grand tour, wrote columns from all the capital cities of Europe, and then, trained their way into Rome.
Wow. Rough job.
I know.
Can you? Boy, did they luck out they were there in the golden age.
Yeah, it was the golden age of sports.
And now you got Shirley's son Maury. God, what a come down, man alive! All right, we're talking to David Marinus about his book Rome 1960, and we got some callers here. Frank in Greensburg, go ahead, please.
Hi, David. Love your books, and you got the gold member talk show host here with you today.
All right.
So listen, David, I had read a story one time. I don't know if it was the 60 or 64 Olympics, but this was years ago. But there was the U.S. track team, a significant number of members came down sick.
Yeah.
Like during the Olympics, and they were basically blaming it that the Soviets. They blamed them for basically like giving them food poisoning or something like that. Did you come across that at all? This was years ago that I read this, but it was like half the team came down sick before the Olympics.
Yeah.
Did you recall that?
Well, I know half of the story. I mean, a lot of the American track stars did get sick before the Rome Olympics. I'd never heard it blamed on the Soviets. They blamed it on fruit that they'd eaten or a trip they had to take. Through Switzerland.
What the base of that was that they said that one of the guys that served them at their hotel and everything, they found out later they determined it was like a Soviet agent or something like that. This was something I read. It was years ago. I mean, I wish I could even think where I read it. It was like it was a story on the various Olympic teams. It might even been
it didn't happen in 1960 that I know of.
Okay, it didn't happen in but it wouldn't. Oh, that's okay.
But a lot of them did get sick, and it affected the performance of several of the track and field members.
There was all this talk this year about whether or not certain heads of state would go to China for the opening ceremonies and all of that. Did heads of state used to go, and were opening ceremonies anything more than the teams marching in, or didn't they even bother with that?
The opening ceremony was, it was quite something, but no, heads of state did not go. Eisenhower was nowhere near it. He was back in Washington and really had underestimated the propaganda value of the Olympics altogether, and was sort of making several diplomats, American diplomats in Europe, scratch their heads about why he was not paying attention to it. Khrushchev did not go either. As a matter of fact, before those Olympics ended, he went to the Baltic and got on a ship and set sail for New York and the United Nations for his famous appearance there.
You mean when he was slamming his shoe on the table?
Well, it wasn't a shoe, as it turns out. You know, that's kind of an interesting myth. There's no videotape of that.
Isn't that odd? Because I swear to God, yeah. I can see it.
Well, you can see it, but you never saw it.
Wow.
And the latest great biographers of Khrushchev say, no, it wasn't a shoe, it was a fist. He took his shoe off, but he didn't pound it.
You are kidding. So no, that is absolutely apocryphal.
Yes, it is. And I got into it in the book because I wrote about his trip, and then I interviewed Philip Taubman, who's wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Khrushchev, and he said there's no videotape of it, and his best reporting is that he did not pound his shoe.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think I saw it.
But
that's a power of what?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh, that's sort of frightening.
Yeah.
Let me get another caller in for you. Kurt in Bloomfield, go ahead, please.
Good morning, Lynn and David. I was thinking about how commercialized the Olympics are today. Were they all that much commercialized back then, or didn't a lot of people have televisions back in 1960?
Television was that was the beginning of the television age. I think about 70-some% of the people had televisions. Close to 80%. It was getting up there at that point. But no, it was not very commercialized. Coca-Cola was one of the commercial sponsors, but there were very few. Because there was only an hour or so of television every night, it wasn't bought and paid for by commercial enterprises.
Okay.
This year I say the U.S. basketball team is essentially the Nike team, not the U.S. team.
Isn't that true?
It wasn't like that then.
Well, also, I heard somebody suggest that all of these records that are being broken in the water, it should be called the Speedo Olympics too.
Well, yeah, I mean that new Speedo suit is having an actual profound effect.
It doesn't seem right then that these records should be records if it's because of this suit.
Well, in certain sports, technology makes a difference. I mean, in the pole vault in 1960, it was the last pole vault that was not a flexible fiberglass pole.
Yeah.
So it was, the heights increased by feet after that. When they went to the fiberglass. So, that sort of thing changes in a lot of different sports.
So, did I remember reading something to the effect that you said that this game, changed so much. So much was in flux. But the role of women in the Olympics
very much changed, yeah.
In what ways?
Well, here's the reason. And it's an interesting fact about the Cold War. It had a positive effect on the advancement of women in the U.S. because the medal count is a combined men's and women's medal count, and the Soviets and European countries were much more progressive in terms of women in sports. And so the U.S. had to get going after that because of that simple fact. It was part of the Cold War propaganda. On another level, women until 1960 were not allowed to run more than 400 meters. It was considered unladylike.
Oh my God.
And so finally they got the 800 meters in Rome. It wouldn't be until 1984
that we could do a marathon?
We could do the marathon, yes.
84?
Yep.
And what was the thing? Our poor little legs couldn't do it?
Well, what happened was in the 1920s there had been an 800-meter women's race, and a couple of women collapsed during the race, and so the male establishment went nuts. Even though men collapse
all the time.
Yeah. So that was it for 40 years. And,
Good heavens. Isn't that something? Now, you confused me a little bit before because, 1960 summer, yes, it was Eisenhower was president, but when we were talking, you said that President Kennedy invited Rudolph, so this was after he wanted to meet her.
She came to the White House in early 61. Kennedy and Nixon were having their campaign and debates, right during those Olympics.
Right, exactly. Where were the 64 Olympics? I can't place
Tokyo.
Okay, and those really were those, so that was the beginning of sort of what we would think of as the modern
I think
Olympics?
60 is, but, you can say either one, yeah.
Well, you could write another book, Tokyo, 1964.
I'm not writing about another football coach. I did Lombardi. I'm not writing about another Olympics. And I'm not writing about another baseball player.
Well, what the heck are you going to write about?
I don't know.
Really?
Maybe Obama. Maybe Billie Jean King. I'm not sure.
Now, you wrote a very, people I think call it a prescient book about Bill Clinton.
Well, that was my first book. And, he's still doing the same things that he was doing when I was writing about him.
The title is eluding me.
First in his class.
First in his class, right.
First of the baby boomers to be president.
Right. So, but, I can't imagine that, everybody and his mother is going to be writing about Obama. But
yeah, you're right. That's why I might not do it.
Well, so what happens to an author like you who really is very prolific, but I'm sort of surprised that you're not on to something else already. You're taking.
Well, I've been written one book after another 5 straight times, so I'm just
taking it easy.
Well, I've written a very, very, very long piece on Obama for the Post that'll appear right before the convention. I'm just not sure I'm going to do a book yet, that's all.
We'll see that in the Washington Post?
Yes.
And your general take, if we can...
Well, it's about the forces that changed him before he changed himself. So it's called Hawaii. It's about everything that happened to him before he remade himself. Mm-hmm. And you'll have to read it. I think it explains them pretty well.
Well, I would love to read it, but you'll have to. Oh, the article. I was going to say you have to write it first. I was thinking of a book. Okay, I will definitely read it. I also just give me a quick take. You think he's gonna win?
I'm not pressing on that, but
what do you think?
I think unless there's a disaster, he will win.
You really do?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that'll sure be a watershed. That'll sure be an election that changes things.
That's for sure.
Well, I certainly hope so. We'll look forward to reading your piece in the Washington Post. I'll look forward to reading the book I just interviewed you about. I feel like an idiot doing things a little backwards here.
That's all right. You did a great job.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
the book
Lynn.
is
Good
Rome
talking to you.
1960. Good talking to you,
You
too.
too.
Thank you. Bye-bye. David Marinis. We're both from Wisconsin. We have a little bit of stuff in common. Can't help it. It's supposed to be a great book. What I did is looked up all the reviews of it, mostly raves, because he's just a heck of a writer, Pulitzer Prize winner. But I know what you're thinking. Why should I buy it? I just heard the whole thing. That's what I sometimes wonder, why these guys bother to do this, because then you think, why should I buy it?